Good evening, sir. Start. Good evening. Am I audible to everyone? Gokul, good evening. Gopi, good evening. Yadav, good evening. Am I audible to everyone? Please respond. Yes, what we discussed yesterday? What we discussed yesterday, please respond. Yes, what we discussed yesterday? Yes, Gayatri, good evening. What we discussed yesterday, please respond. Yes, DBMS. What do you mean by database management system? Yes, query language. What are the different features of DBMS? What are the different features of DBMS? Please respond. Yes, so I was discussing with you about different features of DBMS, and then what I discussed yesterday, what architecture of DBMS, right? So what are the different layers present in the three-tier architecture? Yes, it is a technology used to store and retrieve data. Please respond. So what are the different tiers? For example, three-tier architecture. So what are the different layers present in the three-tier architecture? Yes, application layer, and then so presentation layer, application layer, and then data layer. So till this part, whatever I am discussing, everything is clear. Any doubts so far? Yes, designer, yes, administrator, there will be an end user, and then there will be a designer. So I am going to discuss with you about models, data models. Yes, what do you mean by data models? So the data models, they define how the logical structure of a database is modeled. So far I just gave you some introduction to database, DBMS. What do you mean by DBMS? You want me to explain the architecture again? So let me just explain the architecture. So in case of one-tier architecture, so the DBMS is the only entity. Clear with this? So for example, the user directly sits on the DBMS. So for example, I have a database management system. The user, he is going to do any kind of transactions he want to do. So he will do with the DBMS. Clear with this? So in the single tier architecture, whereas in case of two-tier architecture, so it must have an application through which the DBMS can be accessed. So programmers, they use two-tier architecture, so they can access the DBMS by means of an application. For example, I have, as I was telling you, right, so what is the use of a database or DBMS, database management system? So whenever you can consider any kind of website, for example, you can consider an e-commerce website, Amazon, Flipkart, or you can consider any other type of websites. Clear with this? For example, you can consider an e-commerce website, or you can consider any other type of website, a banking management system, a hotel management system, restaurant management system. So wherever you go, so there will be an application. So whenever I'm going to, in a hospital management system, if I'm going to collect the patient records, I want to store them securely in the database. Clear with this? So there should be a backend database. So what do you mean by database management system? So how I'm going to store, retrieve and manipulate? If I want to do some manipulations, I can go for this DBMS, database management system. Clear with this? So that is the main operation behind this two-tier architecture. So the application tier is entirely independent of the database in terms of operation, design and programming. Clear with this? So what do you mean by this two-tier architecture? So there is one more tier. So in case of three-tier architecture, so for example, in case of three-tier architecture, so for it is based on the complexity of users and how the data present in the database. So it's widely used DBMS. For example, so you have three different tiers. You can, in case of three-tier architecture, you have a presentation tier, and then you have an application tier, and then you have a database tier. So all these are the different tiers that are present in the three-tier architecture. Clear with this? So for example, from the name you can just understand what do you mean by a presentation tier, what do you mean by an application tier, and what do you mean by a database tier. So all these are the different tiers or layers present in the three-tier architecture. For example, I have this data tier or database tier. So database resides along with its query processing language. So they have the relations that define the data and their constraints at this level. So it is called as a database tier or data tier. Clear with this? So I have different tiers. I have an application tier or middle tier. So it presents an abstracted view of the database. From the name you can just understand. So what do you mean by this data tier? I am going to discuss. So firstly, I am just discussing with you about DBMS. What do you mean by database management system? So next I will be discussing with you about SQL. So what do you mean by structured query language? What do you mean by this structured query language? So if I want to insert some records, or if I want to delete some records, or if I want to make some updations, I can go for this SQL, structured query language. So what do you mean by this data tier? The database resides along with its query processing language. So I have the relations that define the data and their constraints. So whenever I'm going to store some data in the database, so I can import some constraints. I can go for primary key constraint, or I can go for foreign key constraint. Clear with this? So what do you mean by this data tier? So three-tier architecture. So I have this data tier. And then I have this application tier, middle tier. So what do you mean by this application tier? So it presents an abstracted view of the database. So this is what is called as an application tier. What do you mean by this abstracted view? For example, in an application, so they may not be aware of any other user beyond the application tier. So I don't know, there is some database. So the end users are unaware of any existence of the database beyond the application. It provides an abstracted view. So it is the correct term. So whenever I'm going to discuss with you about application tier or middle tier, so it presents an abstracted view of the database. So and then I have this user or presentation tier. So what do you mean by this presentation tier? So end users, they operate on this tier and they know nothing about the existence of the database beyond this layer. So multiple views of the database can be provided by the application. So this is what is called as the presentation tier. So the end users, they operate on this tier and they know nothing about the existence of database beyond this layer. Clear with this? So from the name you can just understand. So multiple views. So when I was discussing with you about the features of DBMS, I was discussing with you about different features. Concurrent access, multiple views of the database. So what do you mean by multiple views? For example, a person in a sales department or a person in an admin department, so he can have different views of the database. So at this layer, multiple views of the database can be provided by the application. So with that, I just stopped yesterday. Today I am going to continue with the data models. So what do you mean by this data models? So the logical structure of a database can be modeled. So whenever I have any database, so the DBMS, whenever I am going to consider any kind of website, so DBMS database, it plays a very important role. So I need to store the records securely in the database. What do you mean by a data model? From the name you can just understand. What do you mean by a data model? So the data models, they define how the logical structure of a database can be modeled. So they are the fundamental entities to introduce abstraction in a DBMS. They define how the data is connected to each other and how they are processed and stored inside the system. For example, you can consider anything. You can consider a restaurant management system, or you can consider a hospital management system, or you can consider some other type of system. So whichever systems. So what do you mean by this data models? So they define how the data is connected to each other and how they are processed and stored inside the system. Clear with this? So for example, I have in a hospital management system, so if I want to store some patient records, so I have a patient table, or if I want to store some other medical records, I can go for different tables. So the data models, they are the fundamental entities to introduce abstraction in DBMS, database management system. So the data models, they define how data is connected to each other. So I am going to discuss with you about relations as well. So what is the relation between different tables? There can be one-to-one relation, one-to-many, or many-to-one. So what do you mean by a model? So as it is correctly said, it defines how the logical structure of a database is modeled. So the data models, they define how data is connected to each other and how they are processed and stored inside the system. Clear with this? So what do you mean by this data model? So I'm going to discuss with you about different types of data models. So I just gave you some introduction to data models. So I'm going to discuss with you about ER model. So what do you mean by this entity relationship model? So what do you mean by an entity? Model is based on the real world entities. So entity diagram, whenever you are going to consider whenever I am going to deal with database, so entity ER model or entity relationship. So what do you mean by this entity relationship? It just describes the relationship between various tables present in my database. Clear with this? So whenever I'm going to discuss with any real world scenario, for example, a database model, the ER model creates entity set, relationship set, attributes and constraints. So what is the relationship between different tables present in my database? Attributes. And I'm going to impose some constraints. So what do you mean by this constraints? For example, if I want some primary key or foreign key constraints, so what's the use of constraints? So ER model is based on the notion of real world entities and relationships among them. So it is going to create, so whenever for example each and every class a separate entity is being created. So when you consider hospital management system, so I can have a patient entity. So each and every class is represented by a separate entity, ER diagram or ER model, entity relationship model. So the ER model, it creates an entity set, a relationship set, general attributes and constraints. So the ER model is best used for the conceptual design of a database. Whenever I'm going to develop any, for example, you're going to develop a database for a corporate company. So what are the different modules that are present? You can imagine. So you will have a separate module in order to store the employee records. And you will have a separate module in order to store the admin records. And you will have a separate module. So you will be having some separate module in order to store different types of records. So conceptual design, as the name goes here, right? So the ER model is best used for the conceptual design of a database. So it's based on entities and their attributes, relationship among the entities. So what are the different entities that are present in a database and their attributes and relationship among the entities? So what is the relation among the different entities present in the database? So each and every entity you can consider an ER model. For example, this is how, from this picture pictorially you can just understand what do you mean by this entity relationship model. So you have entities and attributes. So there is each and every entity present in the data model. There is a relationship between my entities. So what do you mean by this attributes? The columns in the table, they are called as attributes. So each and every independent class, it is represented as an entity in the table. So I have this entity and it contains some attributes. And what is the relationship between the different entities present? Clear with this? So what do you mean by this data model? Whenever I am going to discuss with you about entity, so what do you mean by an entity? So it is a real world entity relationship model. So it is a real world entity having properties called attributes. For example, I am going to develop a database for an academic institution, a school database. A student is considered as an entity, a standalone unit, or it is called as an entity. For example, inside an academic institution, so why I have to create some database? I want to store something, store the data in a secured manner. So whenever I am going to consider this school database, so I can consider a student is considered as an entity. For example, I have this student as an entity. For example, it can consider, I'm going to consider a student table. I want to store the student records. So whatever is the student ID, student name, designation of the student has various attributes like name, age, class. Attributes, they provide some information about my student class or student entity. So student, it has various attributes like name of the student, it contains the age of the student, class, and relationship. So whenever I am going to consider any ER model or ER diagram, so all these are the different modules, or you can call them as units, components. So I have an entity and there is a relationship. So what do you mean by this relationship? So I have different entities in a database. Different entities, or you can call them as different classes. And what do you mean by this relationship? The logical association among entities, it is called as a relationship. Clear with this? So what do I mean by this relationship? So what is the logical association? That is a relationship between different entities in a database. So the logical association among entities, it is called as a relationship. So the relationships are mapped with entities in various ways. So how I'm going to relate the different tables in a database? For example, I'm having a customer in an e-commerce industry. You can imagine I'm developing any kind of website. In an e-commerce industry, so I have a customer table and I have a purchase order table. So whenever the customer he is going to place some order. So what is the use of a relationship? So for example, I want to define the relation between the different tables, association or relation. For example, a single customer can make a several purchase or several orders, can place several orders. So what is the relationship between the customer table and an order table? One-to-many relationship. So when I have entities, I need to establish some relation. So how I'm going to relate each other with the help of constraints? I'm going to discuss with you about constraints as well. So how I'm going to relate each and every customer with the order? So there will be a customer ID or order ID. So customer, I'm going to map each and every unique customer with the corresponding order, whatever they have placed. So what do you mean by this association or relationship between the entities? So mapping cardinalities, they define the number of association between the two entities. So whenever I have two separate entities, what are the different types of relations? So I can have one-to-one relation, one-to-many relation, many-to-one and many-to-many relation. Clear with this? So what do you mean by this relationship? So what do you mean by this entity and what do you mean by relationship? So all these are the different types of mapping cardinalities. So I can have one-to-one relationship between the different entities in my database. Or I can have one-to-many relationship. So what is the relationship between different entities present in my database? I have one-to-many relationship, many-to-one or many-to-many. So all these are the different types of mapping cardinalities. So next I'm going to, so far I just gave you some introduction to models. So what do you mean by this ER model? What do you mean by an entity and attributes, and through a relationship, how I'm going to associate two entities? By means of a relationship. So till this part, whatever I'm speaking, everything is clear? Any doubt so far? If you are interested, you can go to InstaMojo and you can register for DBMS Internship Program, DBMS MC. This is the coupon code. Once you register for the internship, you will be getting access to the PPTs, the recorded videos, the project files, how the projects are being developed. You will be gaining more practical knowledge. Once you attend this masterclass for 25 days, you will be receiving a free webinar certificate, and the internship users, they will be receiving an internship certificate as well as a participation certificate. if you are interested, you can go to InstaMojo and you can register for DBMS Internship Program, DBMS MC. This is the coupon code. Once you register for the internship, you will be getting access to the PPTs, the recorded videos, the project files, how the projects are being developed. You will be gaining more practical knowledge. Once you attend this masterclass for 25 days, you will be receiving a free webinar certificate, and the internship users, they will be receiving an internship certificate as well as a participation certificate. Clear with this? So what we are going to see in this 30 days masterclass? So firstly, I will be giving you some introduction to DBMS. What do you mean by database management system? So I just started with some important concepts. So I'm going to discuss further. And then I will be giving you a brief introduction to SQL. What do you mean by structured query language? How to create tables, how to insert records, delete records. And then I will be discussing with you about MongoDB. So what do you mean by this, and how to create collections and how to develop some projects using MongoDB. So this is what we are going to see in this 30 days masterclass. If you are interested, you can go to InstaMojo and you can register for DBMS Internship Program, DBMS MC. This is the coupon code. Once you register for the internship, you will be getting access to the PPTs, the recorded videos, the project files, how the projects are being developed. You will be gaining more practical knowledge. Once you attend this masterclass for 25 days, you will be receiving a free webinar certificate, and the internship users, they will be receiving the internship certificate as well as a participation certificate. So till this part, whatever I am speaking, everything is clear. So I just gave you some introduction to models. So what do you mean by models? I was discussing with you about relational data models. Next I am going to discuss with you about relational models. So the most popular data model in DBMS is the RDBMS, Relational Database Management System. So when compared to DBMS, what do you mean by RDBMS? That is Relational Database Management System. So I am going to each and every class, it is defined as a separate entity in the database. So with the help of this relational model, so I am going to define the relationship between the various tables present in my database. For example, all these are the different attributes that are present in the model. So whenever I am going to consider any table, so I have this student ID, whatever is the student name, student age, class, section. So I am going to define the relationship between the various attributes present, or I am going to establish a relationship between various tables. So data is stored in tables called relations. So how I am going to establish a relationship between various tables in my database? So next I am going to discuss with you about schemas. So far I just gave you this introduction to models. What do you mean by data models? How I am going to establish some relationship? So next I am going to discuss with you about database schema. So what do you mean by this database schema? So it's the skeleton structure. It represents the logical view of the entire database. Clear with this? For example, it is the skeleton structure. It represents the logical view of the entire database. So this is what is called as a schema. So it defines how the data is being organized and how the relations among them are associated. Clear with this? So what do you mean by this database schema? So it defines how the data is organized and how the relations among them are associated. Clear with this? So what do you mean by this database schema? So it defines the logical structure. I'm going to give you a logical view of the entire database. So it defines how the data is organized and how the relations among them are associated. So a database schema, it defines its entities and the relationship among them. So what is the relationship among different entities? Clear with this? So what do you mean by this database schema? It formulates all the constraints that are to be applied on the data. So whenever I have any data, so I should impose some constraints. Clear with this? So what do you mean by this constraint? So I can impose some primary key constraint. I'm going to discuss with you about different types of constraints that can be applied on the data. So a database schema, it defines its entities and the relationship among them. For example, whenever I have any schema, it defines its entities. So what are all the different entities and what is the relationship among them? Clear with this? So it contains a descriptive detail of the database. It can be depicted by means of schema diagrams. So what do you mean by a database schema? It defines its entities and the relationship among them. So what is the relationship between different entities? So database designers, they are going to design the schema. So whenever I have several tables. So whenever I have several tables, I need to establish some relationship. So as I was telling you, right, whenever I'm going to develop any website, so I'm going to use RDBMS, not a normal database management system. I require a relational database management system. So I'm going to establish some relation among the different tables present in my database. So what do you mean by this database schema? So it is the database designers, they design the schema to help programmers understand the database and make it useful. Clear with this? So firstly, I should understand the database and then I'm going to make it useful. So what do you mean by this database schema? For example, pictorially from this picture, you can just understand. So whenever I have any database, for example, I'm having this student table. So I have this student ID, student name and project ID. So I have a physical schema and a logical schema. So I'm going to discuss with you about different types. So I'm giving you a simple example, a student database. So you can imagine anything. For example, if I want to store some employee records, so I can have some employee schema. So it is, as I was telling you, right? So what do you mean by a database schema? So it represents the logical view of the entire database. So how, for example, I have a employee in a corporate company. For example, I have an employee table, I have an admin table, sales table. So how a person in the sales department, he is going to view the employee details, or an admin person, he is going to view employee details, what is the annual sales of the company. So it provides a schema, a logical structure, a skeleton of the entire database. So what are the different tables that are present in the database, and how the different tables, how the data in different tables, how they are being related to each other. For example, this is a student table. It contains the student ID, student name, project ID. So view 1, view 2, and then view 3. So I have this logical schema and physical schema. So a database schema, it can be divided into two categories. For example, I have this physical database schema, and then I have this logical database schema. So what do you mean by this physical database schema? So it pertains to the actual storage of data. For example, I want to store files, indices. So physical database schema, so actual storage of data. So how the data will be stored in a secondary storage. So a database schema, it can be divided into two categories. The first one is called as a physical database schema, and the second one is called as the logical database schema. So this type of schema, it defines all the logical constraints that need to be applied on the data stored. So it defines tables, views, and integrity constraints. So what are the different types of constraints that should be applied? So I can go for logical database schema. Clear with this? So what do you mean this schema, and what do you mean by a physical database schema, and what do you mean by a logical database schema? So whenever I have different tables, I should impose some constraints. For example, whenever I'm going to consider some employee ID, so it should be unique. So I'm going to impose some primary key constraint. And I have some integrity constraint, views, and database instance. So I'm going to distinguish between the two terms individually. So database schema is the skeleton of the database. It is designed when the database doesn't exist at all. So what do you mean by a database instance? So a database instance is a state of the operational database with the data at any given time. So every instance state. So what do you mean by this DBMS, database management system? So what is the use of this DBMS? It ensures that its every instance state is in a valid state by diligently. I'm going to follow all the validations, constraints. So what are the different constraints? So I'm going to discuss with you whenever I have several columns in a database. For example, I'm going to collect the employee details. Whatever is the employee ID, employee name, what is his designation, salary. So I'm going to impose several constraints on different types of fields. So whenever I'm going to go for employee ID, so I should go for primary key constraint. Or whenever I want to go for example, I have salary of an employee, designation, not null constraints. Clear with this? So what do you mean by this multi-layered architecture, and what do you mean by this schema? So this is one important concept. So firstly, you should understand what do you mean by an instance, and what are the different types of schema. Basically, I have physical database schema and logical database schema. So physical database schema, so whenever you are going to consider this physical database schema, it pertains to the actual storage of data. For example, I can store the data in the form of files, indices. So it defines how the data will be stored in a secondary storage. So this is what is called as physical database schema. And there is one more database schema. It is called as a logical database schema. The schema defines all the logical constraints that need to be applied on the data stored. For example, I have several tables. I was discussing with you about the features of DBMS. It supports multiple views. For example, a person in a sales department, he is going to view the annual sales of a company. For example, I am going to view, for example, from a sales department, or I am going to from a marketing team. So if I want to view, so I want to go for from his point, what are the different tables and integrity constraints. A database instance. Clear with this? So database schema is the skeleton of the database. Whereas, what do you mean by this instance? It is a state of the database with data at given time. So next I'm going to till this part, whatever I'm speaking, everything is clear. I just gave you some introduction to what do you mean by models, what are all the relationship between the models. And then I gave you some introduction to schemas. So what do you mean by a schema? It is nothing but a logical structure of a database. So next I'm going to discuss with you about data independence. So what do you mean by this data independence? So if the database system is not multi-layered, it becomes difficult to make any changes in the database system. So what do you mean by this data independence? For example, it stores data about the data. A database system normally contains a lot of data in addition to the user's data. So what do you mean by this? So it contains some data about data. It is called as metadata. So what is the use of this metadata? So it is used to locate and retrieve data easily. Clear with this? So it stores the data about data. So it is known as metadata in order to locate and retrieve data easily. So it is difficult to update, for example, it is difficult to modify or update a set of metadata once it is stored in the database. So as a DBMS expands, it needs to change over time in order to satisfy the requirements of the user. Clear with this? So whenever my database management system it expands, it needs to change over time in order to satisfy the requirement of a user. So tomorrow I will just continue with data independence. So today I just gave you some introduction. With this, I am just stopping today. If you have any doubts, you can just ask me. If you are interested, you can go to InstaMojo. You can register for DBMS Internship Program, DBMS MC. This is the coupon code. Once you register for the internship, you will be getting access to the PPTs, the recorded videos, the project files, how the projects are being developed. You will be gaining more practical knowledge. Once you attend this masterclass for 25 days, you will be receiving a free webinar certificate. And the internship users, they will be receiving an internship certificate as well as a participation certificate. I will start with data independence once again. I just started with the topic. Srinivas, if you are interested, you can go to InstaMojo and you can register for DBMS Internship Program, DBMS MC. This is the coupon code. Once you register for the internship, you will be getting access to the PPTs, the recorded videos, the project files, how the projects are being developed. You will be gaining more practical knowledge. Once you attend this masterclass for 25 days, you will be receiving a free webinar certificate and the internship users, they will be receiving an internship certificate as well as a participation certificate. Any more doubts? Any doubts in today's topic, whatever I discussed? Mohammed, what is your doubt regarding the views concept? Any more doubts? I hope I'm clear with my topics. I started with data models and schemas. Schema is the logical structure of the database, whereas an instance, I'm going to create a database instance, a state of the data, that is called. For example, if I don't have any database, for example, I'm going to create an instance of my database. Whereas a schema, it contains the information about what is the relation between the different tables. It provides a logical view of the database. I'm going to discuss with data independence tomorrow. Data models. I was discussing, right? What do you mean by a data model? For example, I was discussing with you about different types of data models. What is the entity? For example, I have different entities. What is the relationship between different entities? So each and every class, it is the conceptual design of a database. Whereas a schema, I am going to discuss with you about the entire database. A model is nothing but a conceptual. I have different entities. What are the different attributes? So I'm going to, what is the different relationship between the different entities? Whether it is one-to-one, one-to-many. Whereas a schema, it is nothing but, I have a different databases in an entire organization. So I'm going to find out a logical picture or logical view of the entire database. Clear with this? A model is applicable only for a single database. Yeah, ER model, entity relationship. What is the relationship between different entities? Whereas a schema, I'm going to apply to the entire database. Any more doubts? A database is a place where you are going to store data, a server where you are going to deploy any application. Yes, a standalone unit is called as an entity, or you can represent them as tables in database. So coding, whenever I am going to discuss with you about SQL, I will start with coding. So now I started with DBMS. Coding in DBMS. Firstly, I will just start with the DBMS concepts and then I will start with SQL. DBMS is database management system, whereas RDBMS, relational database management system. So whenever I want to establish some relationship among different tables or entities present, so I can go for RDBMS. I'm going to discuss with you about SQL and then I will be discussing with you about MongoDB. MongoDB is a NoSQL database. Yes, you have to install SQL, Ramesh. Any more doubts? Yes, remaining things we will see tomorrow. Same time, same link. Thank you all.